Welcome to the channel Tribe. This video is a part of our webinar series TT Tribecast. In this episode, we are having Ashok Thiruvengadam talking on the topic Smart QA role of human intellect.
Hi Ravi. So if you still think that I'm not as loud-mouthed and therefore I'm not audible, let me know. Normally this works extremely well. All I've done is I've cut off the background AC noise, so I guess it probably should be okay. So the context that I was trying to set up is that the act of software development has significantly changed over the last quite a few years, especially the last 5 years to be precise. I guess what has really occurred there is that we've gone through a lot more smarter ways of development. One is, of course, exploitation of tools. And I think secondly, I think there's been an extraordinary amount of leverage that has occurred. Leverage as in terms of trying to reuse stuff that has been built, either in the form of frameworks, patterns, services, components, and so on and so forth. And therefore, there's been an enormous amount of acceleration in how you can build today. On the contrary, I think that we are, as a testing as a discipline, is still a bit of a laggard in terms of what we do, though there seems to be just a lot more focus on the automation piece. But most unfortunately, the entire discussion of testing, it's been mistakenly bucketized, in my opinion, as manual and automated. I think it's neither any of these terms, sadly. It's just not those terms, because they really don't give you a decent sense of what we're trying to do, because they really take away the intelligent nature of testing, the mystery of exploring a piece of code and trying to find some interesting observations, some of them which turn out to be bugs, the craftsmanship of the entire act of what we do, and the absolutely skillful exploitation of tooling, which is not just limited to tools, but tooling in the larger context, and sincerely the joy of perfection, that we are contributing something more to the greater good, to the people, community, and the business. And therefore, I think we have, in a sense, using words like manual, which to me sounds largely kind of like a coolie, because it's kind of labor, when you say manual, it's a lot more associated with the notion of labor. So we've kind of relegated this act by giving it this unfortunate term called manual testing to a kind of a more mundane, boring act. And therefore, I think that we're missing the cerebral fun that's extremely important to delivering meaningful outcomes to the business and the people who consume the products and the solutions, and not just find bugs. I think we just do a little more bigger things than just finding bugs. It affects business, it affects people. It makes the act of using a software joyful if you do a very good job. And therefore, in today's age of speed and smarts, I believe it's only very natural that testing become far more smarter than what we practice now. And what I mean by smart is the ability to use our intellect to do things better. And that doesn't mean manual or automated. It just means that we are intelligent enough to use exploiting tools along the way to do things simply far better, far faster. And of course, from a business standpoint of view, the question of cost does come in, so far cheaper. And that's really what value at the end of the day is all about. And that's, to me, is the context of what I mean by smart QA. So I'm not trying to invent any other term here. I'm just trying to put two terms, the common word of the smart with what we do as in terms of a QA. That's really what I'm trying to do here in the context. So one of the questions that was asked was, look, what does it mean to be, a smart QA? I mean, all of us are primarily focused on delivering great solutions and products. So we have specialized over many, many years into doing this job really very, very well. And as businesses change, as the act of development has changed, is changing and changed, I think there is only a natural propensity for us to see this act of QA in some sense far more work together with the context of development. So that said, there is obviously a far more reliance on technology that we have to be conversant with. That means language, programming, technology, tools as appropriate. And it is no more just the act of a technical kind of a testing or using the left brain. It requires a lot more in my right brain. So we can call it creative, if you will. So the ability to be far more cerebral so that we can actually do less by one maybe preventing, by one helping people to do things better in the earlier stage, to do as much less as possible, by making appropriate choices as we do things. So the intent here is to leverage our intellect far superior, not only from our context of what we do as test, but from a larger context of software engineering and the bigger, larger context, I think, or the largest context, if you will, of learning from other disciplines, being inspired from other things that we do, and so on and so forth. So I think the expectation of the role of a QA is far higher compared to what it has possibly ever been in all these years. And I think it's only natural that it continues to stay that way. And as systems become intelligent, we can exploit systems and their intelligence to allow us to do things far better so that we can delegate some and focus on some more. So that is in a sense, to me, where the notion of smartness comes. At the end of the day, it is just having, obviously great fun and delivering something stunning to what we do. So let me try to go back, and so I hope I've given you a bit of a context as to what I mean by smart. So ultimately, smart is, ultimate smartness is, I think, is really about kind of not doing anything but getting things done. If I could, put it in a very simplistic fashion, that means, it's really about doing as less as possible, enabling people to do better so that we can do less as possible, and exploiting, delegating things to tools and technologies so that we can do less as possible. So I think when we become more smarter and intelligent, we are still delivering absolutely stunning results with the possibly far less work that we end up doing. And I think that's something that's a holy grail that we all search at the end of the day, and we continue to do so. So that said, some of the questions from Josle, who talked about how to creatively alter the test cases when you have less time before release. How do you test smarter? What is the smart automation strategy, etc. I will try to give some perspectives and some of these as we go along. And of course, there's a very interesting bunch of questions, I would think, from Sandeep, who's got, I think, about something like about a dozen questions out here. So I think, the larger context that I understand in the entire stuff is, yes, we are focused on testing, we are focused on test cases, we are focused on coverage, we are focused on all the technical matters that possibly matters to what we do. But I think it's terribly important in this time and age to put some of these in a much larger context. And what that would mean is, well, there are possibly things like test cases that we come up with, scenarios we come up with, and we test and worry about coverage. And we always have this quote unquote the challenge of time. But now I think we need to relook at some of these things. Is time really a constraint? In today's world, I think there's no such thing as a constraint. It is just that there is a given time, and we are planning to release something in that given time, which could be, let's say, a week from now or a month from now or whatever. So I think the real question is not about how much can we do, can we do this? It's really about how much can be done, and does it make sense, to do it. So I think in the development sense, once upon a time it was more as, well, I have only X amount of time, so what can we deliver? And therefore we would defeature some products. Much in the same fashion, you have some test cases. You may come up with more as you explore the product, as you play with the product, as you continue to immerse yourself better in the application of the product. So therefore the numbers will possibly increase or decrease. There's no such thing as a constancy in terms of a number. But the real question is what we're really saying is, look, that is the end date that we have, and what would matter, what can we do within that particular piece of time, which would matter to the end customer. So it's and that is where the question, if you really rephrase that question now, is and the question was really well worded, because it's how to creatively alter your test cases. Certainly, I don't think I would be able to answer the question in a very binary notion. But the question is, if we kind of relook at the notion of a time and understand and say, hey, this is this is where the date is. This is the intended business benefits of the product that I plan to deliver. So given the fact that it is going to run on those kinds of environments by these kinds of people when I target to release, and this is the key thing that I'm going to be delivering in this release, I guess that would give us some insight into what I can add in, what I can drop, what I can defer, and therefore give you a better chance in answering the question in terms of what is the notion of creativeness in this entire piece. So a few weeks ago, I kind of wrote a small article where I titled it as 50 tips to smart QA, and one of them was obviously on the notion of time. And what I just put this said that this time is really not a constraint anymore. It is just that that's all we have. That we have a particular time, and all we're trying to do is to see what we can possibly do here. The other question that just had is, what is a smart automation strategy, and does automating something just for coverage really help? How do you smartly position your automation strategy to get maximum ROI? So again, let's kind of elevate this question a little bit to give it a better context. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is exploring products and evaluating products / systems constantly. We do come up with some test cases a priori. We do invent quite a lot of bit along the way. And we try to see how we can, one, increase the level of understanding and evaluate as quickly as possible, and that is where tools come in. So when we talk about tooling in a larger context, then the smart automation strategy, truly, smarter ways to look at automation would be to look at a larger perspective of tooling. Some tools help you to kind of play with the system, interrogate the system, find out some things which will allow us to refine what we do. So they're not really execution oriented. Some of them allow you to evaluate better, and that is where you end up scripting it in whatever form, whether you use a particular tool or use a language to end up scripting it, that's your call. So some of them are evaluation oriented. Some of them are tools that will that possibly help us, to assess, to measure a few things so that we know if it is kind of working or not. So when we look at it from a larger perspective of tooling, and just not in terms of a script as what sometimes we interpret it by automation, then we are probably getting a lot more smarter in how we are exploiting technology to do our job, and not be confined to tools from a scripting and execution standpoint. Now, whether we do it humanly, whether we do it using a machine, obviously there is a time and cost associated with what we do. Now, there are certain things that we do in a very continual fashion. So maybe there are certain behaviors, certain flows, certain scenarios that are constantly executed, which seemingly lend itself to be, hopefully done by a machine rather than me, because it makes possibly business sense, especially from a cost standpoint, point of view, and a time point of view. So if there are certain well-known pieces, then obviously I think we end up naturally automatic and calling it regression, and therefore look at it from a perspective of ROI. But remember, those kind of scripts are not by definition designed, or are not intended to yield issues, because they're more like health checks. They're more like telling you, hey, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. So I think those kinds of test cases, which are really I'm fine test cases, I mean I'm fine scripts, so to speak, which are done periodically, executed periodically, obviously lend itself very easily to be measured in terms of an ROI. So when we look at a smarter automation, I think we're all I'm kind of putting my head in here and talking about is to look at it from a larger perspective of tooling as an aid to do a job, which may help us understand better, which may help us give us some better insights into what we are doing, which will help us to evaluate, obviously, which will allow us to assess certain things and then refine as we go along, and so on and so forth. Now, another thing that I think, one of the questions was, what are the good resources to go through and acquire expert knowledge as a good tester? What are important things that are in the market today? There are so many technologies coming in, and it's going to be a challenge to learn every day a new tool, etc. So let's again understand here. I think what's today happening is, certainly today the act of building is not anymore is an act of writing raw code from scratch. It's a lot more integration work. So I think the development has leapfrogged into a very strong industrial era of integration. So we are using a plethora of languages, technologies, frameworks to build software today. And a lot of them, large solutions, obviously aren't anymore a piece of code. It is really integrated with a variety of different systems. So there could be a payment gateway and you just link it to the payment gateway. There could be some other systems and you could link it to some other stuff. All of them may be integrated in various fashions. Maybe you use an API, maybe you use a REST, maybe you use a variety of different messaging protocols and so on and so forth. So the act of now evaluation of the system is no more just the notion of the behavior as we used to once upon a time understand from specification. That is sadly not anymore enough. And therefore, what that means really is, as QA professionals, how deeply do we understand the way the systems are built, and not just what was intended or what may be intended to the end users. So it is as much important today to understand the technologies that go forward, appreciate how it is built, so that you know that the integration points, which could possibly be sources of weakness, because a lot more loose ends today, so which means there could be obviously issues arising because of integration, and that is where the challenge today is. So it is not white or black in the conventional sense as we kind of some people put it, but it's really the ability to understand the innards far better, and to therefore establish meaningful probes to be able to evaluate them better. Now, technology is now fairly wide. It depending on what you end up doing, you could say, oh, this is all a bunch of fintech technologies, this is a bunch of IoT technologies, this is a bunch of intelligent, whatever, AI, ML technologies, and so on and so forth, or mobile technology. So technologies by definition are vast. But what is important to understand is what is the degree of depth that is that is required for you to understand. Today, I think it is terribly important to be able to have an ability to broad base and go deep wherever appropriate as quickly as possible. And that is why it seemingly is providing us a challenge. But the challenge is not about learning all the languages. The challenge is not about learning all the tools. The challenge is being able to appreciate the plethora of technologies that may make up the system that we are primarily trying to evaluate, and get a reasonably decent insight so that one can make appropriate choices in terms of how do I go about evaluating, what are certain interesting issues that I should be looking forward to, and understanding potential weak points, strong points about what to do. So technologies will continue to evolve, and we know that it's been evolving every decade. Every decade, there's a new set of technologies that come. Some survive, some fail. Some languages come in, new technologies come in. So I don't think we need to worry too much about what is. It is really about today. I guess if there are certain technologies that are used in our application, then it is paramount that we appreciate it. If they so happen to be some of those which are more popular and they survive a longer time, then certainly you're a little more lucky. Associated with the technology, there might be certain tools, so you probably pick and choose those tools that matter. Associated with the certain technology, there could be certain languages which allow us to enable probing better, so you kind of know what is necessary for you to probe. And that's a constant continual exchange, expansion. But the whole idea here is not, you cannot obviously go into every, into the details and the depth into each one of them, and it's probably not really necessary. So is it sufficient to just expand knowledge and exploratory testing and adapt a new tool? So let me caution you, if I understand it correctly, yes, the act of testing is in a larger context generic. The applicability of what we do to a particular context, in this case a domain, a class of application, a class of technology that is out there, requires intelligent exploration to do that. So the ability to be smartly able, intelligently able to explore, I think is timeless in that sense. But it is not just about tools that we are talking about. We are really talking about the appreciation and understanding of various innards that make up that particular system under construction. And it's not just a tool. So it is not about adapting a tool and learning how to script that is sufficient, right? The ability to intelligently explore and go beyond the technology, go beyond just the product, staying inspired from a lot of other fields, become paramount. I think we will talk about it also. Now, the question that was asked was, in this challenging world, how do you think a smart tester can sustain in the market? These days, companies expect most of the kind of testing to be done by a single person. I'm in a dilemma thinking of this, which to learn, which tool to build expertise in, and so on and so forth. So I think everybody today, be it a developer, be it an analyst, be it a tester, be it anybody in what we do, I think certainly there is a lot more expansion in terms of breadth, in terms of what is expected. So obviously there is a lot more broad basing that has occurred and will continue to possibly occur. Now, the reason for that broad basing that has occurred is certainly from the development aspect, a lot more leverage. That it is possible for you to pick up a framework and write very less code and do a piece of job and get a system done. And that's fantastic. Once upon a time, we had to write a lot of code, but today that's available. And the horsepower of the machines have gone significantly higher, so it's okay to use kind of these frameworks which put a lot of fat to get things done, whereas once upon a time I would be very efficient in how I code. So I'm able to integrate a lot of code that's already available, either from pre-built notions or from other open source pieces. And therefore there is a lot of broad basing that has occurred. So it is only natural in our discipline that we should be mindful, and we should probably fundamentally embrace the act of broad basing. So is that a dilemma? No, that's exactly what's expected today. So you are expected to be conversant with a spectrum of technologies, especially those that matter within the organization that you work with. And depending on the technology, certain tools are meaningful, so you learn them. But it's not just, as I said, it's not just limited to the tool, but it's also about appropriate languages that are closer to those technologies that matter. And that is what really smartness is all about here. It is about being able to appreciate technologies as needed rather than going into deeply. Being able to have the ability to discard what is not needed right now, or better still, being able to defer what is not required to a later time, is a degree of smartness, because there's a lot more that is expected to be able to one that one has to understand. right? So it is not about just a tool. So that's why I started off by saying it is not about manual or automated, and automated is not just about a tool. It is really about uh, using our intellect to be able to appreciate a wider spectrum and using technology and tools as appropriate to get this job. And that is what is needed today to fundamentally sustain. Because as development folks, nobody is writing a lot of code, but a lot of people are writing glue code to integrate variety of different pieces. So the development has leapfrogged in terms of what I would call as the smarter ways of building code, and it's quite natural that that's exactly what's expected. So to your question, Sneha, on the challenging word, how do you think smart tester can sustain? I think that is the only way to really sustain. Becoming fundamentally smarter in what we do, and smartness is not just limited to the act of QA/testing. It expands into the entire realm of software engineering and expands also out of the realm of software engineering here. So some of the questions, so I'm going to kind of just see if I can do justice to the dozen questions of Sandeep, who has been very, very curious in terms of putting together some really lovely questions. So he thinks one of the questions that he wanted to ask is how do you define QA from your experience in assurance or assistance or testing or something? I know words are interesting. They can always be very interesting to debate upon, but certainly I wouldn't want to get into a point of debate just to prove a point in terms of what I think is a word. Certainly, we can always use a variety of different words, is assurance or assistance or testing. So I'm just going to be simple and say, look, I think at the end of the day, you know, we're looking at assurance to a business to a large degree. We are ensuring that there isn't whatever that we do assures to our business and to our customers that they are in safe hands, and to the business it ensures that it's a great product that they can make money with. So I probably would stick the most simplest of the definitions to start with, but I would keep in context that at the end of the day, whatever that we do is not just limited to the technical act of testing, but significantly it is the larger context of um, what I do is significantly important to the business at large, to my company and the business, and it's certainly very important to people who consume my software, whether be it free or be it priced, as to how it changes, how it improves their quality of what they do, and how it ultimately adds value to what they do. So that to me is what QA is all about. Now, this other one that you talked about, Sandeep, is an assumption about this topic, which you stated as you might have chosen this topic because you observed the need for elevated awareness, practices, skills around the logical, scientific, and creative thinking. Is that a sensible assumption? Certainly, yes. So, I think unless we kind of elevate ourselves to connect at a larger level, expanding into the realm of not just one phase of software engineering, but appreciate the larger context of software engineering, going all the way into development and then into analysis on the other side, which is left, if you will, on the other side into the right, where we're really talking about the business and the people who consume and what it means, to their work. It requires that we we have to be certainly be logical and scientific in what we do, but equally importantly, I think it's important we creative. And I mean creative, it is to look at it from multiple points of view, certainly from a business angle, certainly from user angle, certainly from an issue angle, certainly from time angle, certainly from cost angle. So obviously multiple angles, and we obviously have to play a meaningful balance in this entire stuff. And therefore, now the question and definition of what you asked is, what is it? What is the intellect, and what is it different from intelligence? I think intellect is to a large degree the faculty of reasoning, the ability to discern facts, the act of understanding various facts. So it's in some sense a fundamental cerebral thing. So it is more fact oriented, whereas intelligence, though, is a kind of a synonym to the notion of intellect, it's really about the feeling thing. So So when we say, we display a certain intelligence, we are able to use the facts, and that results in feelings, and that really is all about intelligence, truly speaking. So in that sense, yeah, there is this fine point between fact versus feeling, and that's really what intellect and intelligence is. Now, the when we say intellect, we are absorbing facts. Uh, we are improving a faculty of reasoning, the ability to understand objectively, the ability to abstract things. All that is part of the intellect piece. Using that to do things is where intelligence comes in. Now, you ask some questions in the context of intellect and the Western, Eastern kind of a philosophy. See, Western science, by definition, if you look at science, I think Western science is very fact based. Fact based as in terms of what they observe. So, the entire notion of Western scientific thinking is based on a simple premise of you hypothesize, and then you kind of see those facts, and now you see things that fit those facts, and if you are able to fit those facts, you say, okay, the premise is valid, and therefore set up a law or a principle or whatever. That's all. So Western science, by definition, the facts are something that we can see with the typical five senses. I mean, here, absorb using the five senses, which include sight and smell and sound and so on and so on. Eastern system of science is slightly different. We go on to a faculty which is a little more deeper, and therefore we call it the notion of mind and so on and so forth. But the whole idea there, the Western system is not really simply based on the notion of the Eastern system is not simply based on the notion of facts, but I guess it's no, based on a system of belief. So you kind of have the fundamental notion that if you believe very strongly that you can about something, that it's kind of possible for you to make it so, and therefore that it's not something fundamentally provable. So obviously, the way we build our intellect system is by being extraordinarily mindful, extraordinarily inward centric, and therefore start observing with the mind's eye, if you will. So there is obviously a great amount of power in doing that, but I am not going to go through that, though I very, very strongly believe in it, and I have experienced quite a bit from an Eastern system. But that said, to me, it's just a nice, wonderful marriage. So where I kind of think of it, it makes sense in the context of what we do is the act of mindfulness, and therefore the act of being very immersive. And therefore, I call that entire thing as an immersive kind of a test where we explore very immersively, and therefore we are very much inside what we are doing, and therefore able to observe, therefore, far better. So, in that sense, I have a heightened intellect to be able to explore, and therefore what I think far better. So I kind of call that as an immersive session test. Now, the other question that you really had was thinking scientifically, logically, and creatively, what is a split and so on. So I think there is no such split as 80 or a 20 or a 60 or a 40 or whatever, a 50 or a 50. I guess it's that, the smartness comes by the notion of how well we are harmoniously able to be logical. That means we see facts, uh, we make theories, we test it out, we prove, we disprove. So it's very factual in that nature. So that's very Western scientific thinking oriented. So what we call a scientific logic, if you will. The other one is somehow appreciating a few things, getting a few hunches, and being able to do it, which is a bit of an Eastern system of doing things. The third one is really about keeping your mind open, be staying inspired from a lot of outside things, and therefore be creative in that sense. So how do you find that balance? Is there a percentage? I don't think you should really bother about the percentage per se, but I guess it's really being mindful. Am I shifting across all these things in a continual manner? To me, the greatest inspiration to me every time in whatever I do, not just limited to testing, is obviously nature. Um, it seems to be perfect. It seems to continually evolve. It seems not to worry about discarding. you know, leaves have fallen a few weeks ago, and a new set of leaves have come across, and they constantly do that year after year. So when you look at nature and you kind of look, what you're really saying is, have we come into a mental thought process where we are well aware that we are logical, we are receiving some interesting insights via hunches, and we are receiving some fairly interesting creative ideas as we do. And if you think you can be harmonious and therefore be in such sense natural, then you're probably very, very smart in what you're doing. So as long as we don't straitjacket what we do into thinking only this way or only that way, being only logical every time, or only being creative another time, or trying to bucketize, when we naturally meld it meaningfully, I think then that's where magic kind of happens. So to me, hi Rahul. So to me, it's how do you get to that real, how do you get into that kind of state? There isn't a particular mantra to get there, right? So as long as we kind of understand that what we are doing has a larger context and has a higher influence in terms of what we do, and it's not relegated to just finding what we think is bugs, but it's got a significant impact to the business and the community and the people, then it is only natural that you expand your horizon of what you're constantly seeking as knowledge, not limited only to what we do in the context of testing, but certainly appreciate technology, certainly go ahead and understand psychology, certainly go ahead and understand the business domain, certainly look around and read about history and geography. And so obviously it is not, staying inspired or staying creative and staying inspired is not a one day job. It is a constant, continuous effort. I wouldn't say effort, it's joyful in that sense, effort not in the negative sense, and something that where you keep away, file away little nuggets of interesting information in your brain, and you never know when it's going to connect. And that's where these little nuggets sit in your brain, and one day you get some heady inspiration of say, hey, for this I could use that kind of an idea, and so on. So that is where, to me, the notion of curiosity comes in. It's not like I'm curious today, I'm not curious tomorrow, and therefore the key ideas to me is, are we really open and receiving, reading, appreciating, just receiving sometimes a variety of different pieces of information, and therefore not limiting ourselves to this particular tool or this particular language or this particular technique in what we do. And that's a lifelong thing. So how do you harmoniously exploit both your right brain and right left brain? So have you tried to write with both the hands at the same time? Have you tried your hand at sketching and drawing? Have you tried to sing music? They're all things that tickle your right brain kind of a stuff, right? And therefore, have you doodled? So those are the things that really have nothing to do with testing, but then I think they have a significant impact in what we do. And therefore, it goes beyond what one might term as intelligence quotient or IQ, as you one of your question that you put, which is really related to more of a factual intelligence. So it's not anymore just about a factual intelligence that we're talking about, and I think it has terribly a lot of other dimensions that we seem to need at this point in time in what we do. So how do you understand technologies rapidly? Do you read everything? No. How can one be faster? How can one see very different patterns and connect these various patterns? How can one take notes very rapidly? How can one be very pictorial in what we do? All those really, really matter. So about a couple of years ago, I got very, very curious in terms starting to think in terms of visual thinking. So I found out there are at least about 5 very interesting books that I ended up buying, which talked about visual thinking. And one of those books, some of those we understand very well. So I think mind mapping is one such technique that we understand very, very well, or at least practiced a lot more. More recently, of course, there's a term called doodling. I'm sure some of you know it. And I saw a book which is completely written in sketch notes. If you've not read about sketch notes, it's a very interesting way to explain something, to paraphrase something into a sketch note, another interesting page. And there's another book which is primarily about teaching. I think it's a really long book. I mean, long in terms of long format book. I think it's really something like an A3 size approximately. But the book is about explaining variety of different things using only pictures. The whole book was only pictorial. So when you see he was explaining a rocket engine in one place, he was explaining something else on another page. It had nothing to do with testing, but it kind of changed the way I was thinking. How people are so beautifully creative in terms of how they express things, not only by words. So I guess the act of creativity, the act of expansion of our mind, the act of trying to be exploring the right brain, is a tickle that is every day, and that's something that's not limited to tools and not limited to technology and not limited to something. So you see some of those sites that certainly are inspirational, you know which are not limited to testing. So I've learned, I think all of us understand, that living in a well, you just become you're just a frog. But when you go outside of the well, you see a big wide world. So what we learn, of course, there are some absolutely wonderful people here in our community, in our own test drive community, in the worldwide community at large, whose blogs, whose tweets, and whose books we read. And tomorrow, I think you have a lovely gentleman who's going to be doing a webinar, tomorrow, who's going to talk about heuristics. So I think that said, there are a lot of interesting people, a lot of interesting material that come along from the testing context. But that said, there are also a lot of interesting things that are there outside of our community, which I think we should be cognizant of. So obviously, watching a TEDx on dance and fluid movements is as interesting as learning about some tool and technology here. So because some of those things I get very seriously inspired and say, oh, that's something that I, at some point in time it connects and you end up doing something else. And that really is. So when you look at sites or blogs or books, I think over the years I've simply moved out our own discipline of reading, and therefore read in a more wider spectrum, not limited to our domain, and therefore seek inspirations. I wouldn't say seek inspirations, be inspired in some sense by a variety of things outside of our domain. So, so in some sense, therefore, when you really look at some of the tips, what I thought was what was smart, and to give a little bit of context, is some of the tips that I was trying to put in place is, well, some tips to smart QA is, hey, how can I not do work? How can I wouldn't say avoid work, but really prevent work. So what can I do such that I can educate somebody upfront so that I don't have to test, so to speak? How can I do less? How can I just do just as much? How can I do anything really beautifully? How can I adjust constantly? So you may call it agile, but all I'm really saying is, that's what nature does. How can I see the mirror constantly in terms of measures, metrics, numbers, and constantly adjust myself? How can I see what I see consciously, and how can I see things unconsciously? So how do you become mindful? So would mindfulness be important to testing? Hell yes, of course. So mindfulness is not some meditation for something else, so to speak. It is basically the ability to let yourself free and therefore increase your observational skills infinitely, if you will. And that is what unconsciously see to me is. Are we constantly adding, deleting, refining, and evolving? Because what was good yesterday, have we learned to laugh at it and say that's crap? So as much as we absorb and learn and acquire, it's equally important to unlearn. So in a recent discussion with a person whom I was doing an interesting video with, he said that in the current world, he said unlearning is a skill. And it is a skill that is not taught, and people probably don't understand. And this gentleman was a senior person in the industry, and I did a video with him. And I think it's so apt. Certainly, unlearning is a skill. So, how do you let go? It's very hard for us to let go. And that is an important skill that one needs to have to stay and be continuously smart. Now, all of us are extremely focused on the activities. We are very, very focused on running, executing, scripting, and so on and so forth. Yeah, certainly activities are important, but focus on the outcome and enjoy the damn journey. At the end of the day, testing is not some dirty job where we are trying to find bugs within a limited piece of time. If we kind of put it in that context, our ability to what we can deliver from our individual human potential is fairly limited. It is it's an amazing, interesting, enjoyable journey, and certainly outcomes matter to the business at large, and outcomes matter. And outcomes here really are one part of it to the business, and the other part of it, to the end customers in terms of how they love the product. And so it's not just activities and how we accomplish these activities, it is certainly outcomes, but more importantly, are we really enjoying the entire journey? So doing is great, but ultimately understand value matters. And being mindful and therefore doing a far better session-based testing to be able to immerse in the particular act is very interesting, because it suddenly you are able to harness your infinite power potential. And don't do work. One of the part of don't do work is leveraging work. Development community seems to have done it extraordinarily well by leveraging other people's code. Our testing community still got to get there. We are not able to leverage our work as much. So if somebody is doing some work in an area of payments and somebody else is also doing in another area of similar payments, it is very unlikely that there is a common body of knowledge that's available publicly that we can say, hey, here's a bunch of scenarios, here's a bunch of heuristics, or here's a bunch of tool sets that's available for you to use. And therefore, we're still kind of churning again and again the same thing. Whereas I think the developers have possibly done it. And therefore, how do we leverage other people's work? How can we copy? How can we leverage? How can we go to the next level? Be very rational, but trust your gut. See, I think it's terribly important to be rational and scientific, but it's equally important for us to develop that gut over time so that you can use those hunches as we go. Focus is brilliant. Focus is great. But it's very important to meander. It is very important to kind of go around. It's very important to, in some sense, not really get lost, but yeah, meander around, do a bit of get lost, because that's what allows us to understand systems far better and therefore refine, adjust, and deliver better, as we go. The act of decomposing a system, simplifying what we are doing, is a terribly important trait, because most of the times when we decompose a system very well, be it a new system or be it an existing system, and therefore being able to explain it in a very simplistic fashion, the problem itself gets solved. Now, every software engineer, primarily the holy grail, what they do is to relentlessly simplify. And you come to a point where if you can't simplify anymore, then you've got really the stunning system. We know that. The same thing is applicable to what we do. Relentlessly simplify our strategy, our test cases, our ways of doing things. Certainly another important aspect of smartness in terms of QA is, for heaven's sake, write less, accomplish more. So it is not sentences and words that count. It is about writing as less, and certainly using pictorial abilities to be able to to do them. So some of these are some of these smarter tips, tips that might help us to think better and therefore do a lot more with much less. I think we've got just about 3 more minutes or a couple of more minutes. So I'll try to sum it up and round it in what I see. One, They're all wonderful people in our community. So the least that we should possibly do to all the other folks who are inside our community at large, or who are coming into the community, is tell them not to heaven's sake use the word called manual testing. It's a terrible word to use. It's a terrible word that most often associated with a coolie job, and people think that they're elevating themselves when they do automated testing, and they think that manual is not what I am. I certainly I think it's cerebral. So as long as we understand that what we do is, it requires meaningful human intellect, we should be replaceable with a machine. So that's not where I think, that's not what we do on a daily basis. That whatever that we do are is fundamentally replaceable. So certainly, the least that we can do is to help people understand that it is not manual. It is in some sense intellectual in what we do. Yes, sometimes we have to use our two hands and two eyes and whatever sensorial organs to be able to get a job done. But that is not really the notion of testing, right? Yeah, tooling, exploit tooling and technology as much as possible. It is not just limited to tools. It is not limited to testing tools. It's limited to being able to use whatever tools. And I think Ajay wrote a lovely, I think he does a lovely workshop, and he has also written a lovely book where he talks about the 50 tools. And all those tools are not necessarily the selenium of the world or the JMeter of the world or any of this kind of the world. They are little interesting tools which are like the Swiss knife armory that we use from a technology sense to do our job better. And I think we need to therefore reshape our thinking of automated means tools is not that. It simply means that you're fundamentally technology savvy. You are able to appreciate technology. So if some of us are testing an application in the space of IoT or a space of a fintech or a space of an intelligent AI/ML system, we are equally investing effort and time to be able to appreciate the technology at large, do a bit of research to get educated. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to go all the way deep down. It simply means that we broad base, and wherever appropriate, we go deep as necessary. But all of it is time limited. All of it is band limited by the simple notion of what is available time. Because time is not about something that we have as a resource. It is just not a constraint. It's just a particular thing. So I hear you, Mahesh, where I see a message where you said duration is not a hard stop. I have absolutely no problem. It is certainly, it would be lovely to see each one of you and therefore have an interaction. So all I'm now able to do, unfortunately, is to see my damn reflection in a way on the camera. So I'm only delighted that at least I'm able to listen to some of your see at least some of your messages that is out there. So at least it makes it fun. But yeah, if you still think that you enjoy my drone, I have absolutely no problem in continuing on, and happy to answer any more questions that come along as part of the messages. Certainly happy to do that. So I have no issues of time per se, but I'm sure it's not just a question that I'm interested in, but I'm sure each one of you have an interesting viewpoint. That would be also wonderful. If you could share some of your viewpoints as part of the comments in the Facebook comment page. So the whole idea of smartness is, to me, it is, I think, a bit of a do or die situation in terms of us as a discipline. In fact, one of those chaps, when we were doing an interview, when we were doing an interesting video, he said, ultimately we need to elevate the entire QA as not just an activity or a silo. It is really a mindset. And mindset, what it means is not that we work in a QA as a department, but really there are these set of folks who have developed that notion of a perfection mindset, if you will, the value mindset, if you will, and they adapt at a more broad-based set of skills. And that's what makes us far more valuable to the organization and the community and the people at large. And that's something that I think it's terribly important to understand, because there is a fundamental disruption that's happening. I'm sure that you have noticed, certainly I've noticed quite a bit, where sometimes in a lot of organizations, the QA as a function or a department gets merged in. Because I think what is happening is, across the community, the kind of in a way, the artificial wall or the dichotomy of development and testing seems slowly to be merged. It does not necessarily mean that one is not required. It simply means that they are expecting a far more harmonious amount of working, and therefore, it is only necessary that some of us have this stronger mindset of QA, which we can bring to the larger context of software engineering. And that is a disruption, a serious enough disruption that's happening in this phase of what we are doing. Certainly in the product companies for sure. And on the other side, that's happening, other major disruption that's happening is times are shorter, businesses are not really signing up for longer duration. So there's always a constant sense of pressure from a company standpoint of view to how do I continue to roll out revenue? There's no such thing as a longer contract. Be even a product today is available in a nice SaaS model with an ability to break off from the product any month. So you could subscribe to the product on a monthly basis. If you don't like it, you can just snip off. Or if you sign it on a yearly basis, it's sometimes not very huge, and you can just break away the contract and go away. So businesses are under tremendous pressure to ensure that the customers continually use our products, our applications. And therefore, there is a tremendous amount of shift in terms of what the business is. And quite naturally, therefore, it requires a tremendous amount of collaboration among the various parties which build products. Call it the developer, call it the analyst, call it the tester, call it the support guy. So I think all of them suddenly are seen in one big giant bucket. And that's exactly what's happening today. So there is no need for us to be perfectly religious in terms of thinking of testing as a silo. It is terribly important to kind of understand that the silo is part of a larger piece, and all we can as a set of specialist folks is to bring that mindset to the larger context, and that we can only do when we learn to understand other people's languages as much as we understand our languages. So the language of development, the language of technology, the language of tools, the language of empathy, the language of business and finance. So I guess that is where the smartness comes in extraordinarily handy, because these are not something that you can ask a tool to do. These are not something that you can easily train a machine to do, and therefore it's necessary that we exploit that 800 gram, that few, that stuff that's between our two ears. Yes, Rahul. Yes, that's something that I think all of us feel very, very strongly. Stop using the word manual testing. Automated is not premium. Yeah, absolutely understand. It's such a painful irritation when people talk about it, and they think that life is just about these two. Certainly, yeah. And and even in the context of tests, it is not about staying inspired only from technology pieces, but there are a lot of other things that we need to be looking at and being staying inspired with. So move out of just learning or absorbing facts from our technical world, but be open. So I guess I know Rahul writes lovely poetry and shairi, so I've also tried to put my hand in that. So I guess all of us are trying to keep our you know what should I say, the mental age far younger, and trying a variety of different things. So pick up something that you are completely unaware of, and do it, and therefore you are able to exercise your right brain. So if you're bad at drawing, maybe fiddle around with some doodles, and be open enough to listen to a variety of you know different podcasts or different video casts or whatever. So you don't have to think that learning is kind of limited, and learning is not learning about a particular course today. It's about absorbing whatever makes sense and finding it away, and you never know when they all connect internally and some magic happens. And that is where mindfulness comes in very, very handy. Being able to observe inside internally, and suddenly a lot of things really connect. And that to me is the ultimate smartness, the smartness of the, the ability to observe by closing your eyes, observe internally the variety of different things, and being able to make that amazing connections which you wonder, wow, am I really that smart? And that's the magic that happens when you kind of go inward, and that's truly very, very Eastern. So today, of course, the notion of meditation and mindfulness and calm or headspace, as some people call it, is indeed becoming very, very popular. Not just from a life aspect, but in terms of what we can do. So to me, they certainly are meaningful to what we do also, and that is delivering absolutely stunning products. On a slightly different note, um, so we are all people primarily focused on product and quality and perfection. So sometimes, it kind of bothers me, sometimes seriously irritates me when you actually see people who are applying for, let's say, testing kind of positions, QA kind of positions, writing kind of bad resumes. When I say bad resume, it has got spelling mistakes, it's not aligned, it doesn't look well. I think in our in our discipline, we have to understand that we have to be aesthetic in what we do, because at the end of the day there is an enormous amount of joy in the beauty in what we produce, and production does not mean writing code, it is about contributing to the act of great product. So it would be fundamentally terrible if whatever that work that we produce is not of the highest quality. So it might be a good idea for you to spread the message that whatever that we do, not just limited to the notion of product testing and quality, I think we want to demonstrate a degree of perfection and a sense of aesthetics in what we do. So it is about 10:08. I've had an interesting discussion, or I mean, I wouldn't say discussion, I have an interesting monologue from my side, aided by some of the lovely questions that you guys had asked. I hope it was of some interest. This is, I'm sure that I did not give you a very clear, answer one, answer two, answer three, because I don't think it makes absolute sense for me to give a biased answer which I think is right. But it's something that you as a process you will discover. So thank you so much. Um, I do a weekly digest. I think I've shared the website. I would love obviously contributions. I would love obviously your comments. It's a community thing that I'm trying to do. It's nothing to do with my company, though it is hosted as a website within the context of the company, but it's really nothing to do with selling there. So do take a look at it and pass on your comments. And thank you so much for listening in, and have a great weekend and have a great webinar tomorrow. So I'm going to sign off. Yes, Rahul, absolutely. Do we demonstrate quality in everything that we do? Yes, absolutely. We need to fundamentally do that. So quality is obviously not limited to software and bugs. I think we just fail to see the fact that we are, in some sense, the people who, as much as artists produce a wonderful piece of work, we are really artists in the context of software in terms of ensuring that what we produce, hopefully, can be business art. So thank you for that, Rahul. So thank you, Sandeep, for interesting questions, and thank you all, for the lovely questions that you had. I hope it was of some use, because I know you spent a very valuable 1 hour on a Saturday evening, which extended by another 10 minutes. Have a lovely day, guys. And thank you, Mahesh, so much for giving me this opportunity to share some of my views today. This, and I have to obviously thank the gentleman who set me up today, and I think it is Srini Kulkarni. Thank you so much. So I'm going to end the live video now.